What comes to mind when you hear the name Mao Zedong, a heroic liberator who united a shattered nation and defied the world's powers, or a ruthless dictator whose ambitions brought misery and death to millions? The story of Mao is not just the story of a single man. It is the epic and often tragic saga of modern China itself, its wounds, its dreams, and its endless struggle between hope and fear. From the fields of rural Hunan to the palaces of Beijing, from the Red Army's desperate marches to the thunderous applause of Tiananmen Square, Mao's journey is a tale of vision, violence, and contradictions. Tonight, we go beyond the propaganda and the myths. We ask, how did one man shape the destiny of a billion souls? What price did China pay for its unity and power? And what lessons does Mao's legacy hold for us all? This is the real story of Chairman Mao. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in the small village of Shaoshan, deep in the Hunan countryside. His father was a prosperous farmer, strict, ambitious, and determined to see his children succeed. For most boys in rural China, the path was set: work the land, obey your elders, and accept the life you were given. But Mao was restless. Even as a child, he was drawn to books and ideas, spending hours reading by candlelight instead of helping in the fields. He devoured classic Chinese tales, poetry, and unusually for the time, modern political thought. The China Mao was born into was not a peaceful place. For over half a century, the country had suffered under foreign occupation, military defeats, and internal chaos. European powers and Japan had forced humiliating treaties on the old Qing dynasty, carving up Chinese territory and crippling its economy. Poverty, disease, and rebellion were everywhere. The Qing emperors clung to power, but their authority was crumbling. Even in his comfortable household, Mao could not ignore the turmoil. His father, hoping to secure the family's future, arranged a marriage for Mao when he was only 14, but Mao refused. He left home in protest, determined to shape his own destiny. It was a bold and shocking move, especially in a culture built on obedience. Instead of settling down, Mao sought education, enrolling in a modern school in nearby Changsha. There he encountered a world of radical ideas: democracy, science, freedom, revolution. He saw how old China was being challenged by new voices, students, reformers, and dreamers hoping to save the nation from collapse. In these early years, Mao's rebellious spirit found its purpose. He was not content to watch China's decline from the sidelines. He began to believe that real change, true liberation, would only come from breaking the old rules and defying the old authorities. It was here in the final years of the Qing dynasty that Mao Zedong took his first steps toward revolution. As Mao came of age, the old order in China was collapsing at breakneck speed. In 1911, revolution swept the country. The Qing dynasty, over 250 years old, crumbled almost overnight. Excitement filled the air. The promise of a new modern China seemed within reach. Mao joined the revolution as a teenager, enlisting briefly in the rebel army. But when the fighting ended, he found the reality far less inspiring. The Republic of China was weak, corrupt, and plagued by chaos. Warlords carved up the nation, rival factions battled for power, and ordinary people continued to suffer. Disillusioned, Mao threw himself into his studies, first in Changsha and then in Beijing. The capital was alive with new ideas: anarchism, feminism, democracy, Marxism. Mao became fascinated by the Russian Revolution and the writings of Karl Marx. He gathered with like-minded friends in small rooms, debating how to save China from war, humiliation, and endless poverty. These were years of transformation for both Mao and his country. As China's leaders squabbled, young radicals across the nation began to dream of more radical solutions. Mao became convinced that only a complete overhaul of society could rescue China from ruin. In 1921, those dreams took shape. Mao was invited to a secret meeting in Shanghai, joining a handful of activists in the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. It was a tiny, fragile movement, laughed at by the powerful, hunted by the authorities, barely noticed by the world. But for Mao, it was the spark he had been waiting for. Here at last was a vision he could devote his life to, a vision that would ultimately change the fate of a billion people and the course of world history. The 1920s and 1930s were decades of turmoil and bloodshed in China. Barely had the Communist Party found its feet before it was plunged into a brutal fight for survival. At first, the Communists allied with the nationalist Kuomintang, hoping for unity against foreign threats and warlord rule. But in 1927, that fragile alliance shattered. The Kuomintang's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, turned on his communist allies, launching a violent purge in Shanghai. Thousands were killed or disappeared. Across the country, communists were hunted down, driven underground, and forced to fight for their lives. For Mao, these were years of constant danger, loss, and transformation. He witnessed the arrest and execution of his friends and comrades. His own family suffered, his second wife was captured and shot. His young son died soon after. In the crucible of civil war, Mao became both more ruthless and more determined. In the face of relentless attacks, Mao shifted his focus to the countryside. He began building support among China's vast impoverished peasant population, people ignored or exploited by the city elites. With clever propaganda and promises of land reform, he turned the countryside into the communists' new stronghold, but the pressure kept mounting. By 1934, nationalist forces had surrounded the main communist base in Jiangxi. Escape seemed impossible. Then, in a move that would become legendary, Mao led his followers on an epic retreat, the Long March. Over the course of a year, nearly 1,000,000 men, women and children trekked across 5,000 miles of China's harshest terrain. They crossed freezing rivers, climbed deadly mountains, fought running battles, and endured starvation and disease. Less than a quarter survived the journey, but those who did emerged, hardened, united, and utterly loyal to Mao. By the time the Long March ended in the remote north, Mao had become the undisputed leader of the Communist Party. His legend was sealed not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of endurance and revolutionary will. For the Chinese communists, the Long March was more than a retreat. It was the beginning of a new revolution. After the grueling Long March, Mao and his battered followers found themselves in the remote north of China. The odds of survival still seemed slim, but fate and history had other plans. In 1937, the Japanese invasion changed everything. Suddenly, China faced a new and terrible enemy. The communists, once hunted and marginalized, now declared themselves defenders of the nation. Mao's forces waged guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, winning new supporters in the villages and countryside. Throughout World War II, the uneasy alliance between the communists and the Kuomintang held barely. While both sides fought the Japanese, they also maneuvered against each other, preparing for the next round of civil war. By 1945, Japan's defeat left China exhausted and in ruins. The fragile truce collapsed almost immediately. Once again, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were locked in a fight for control. This time, the balance of power had shifted. The communists were battle-hardened, their ranks swollen by new recruits and popular support. The nationalists, drained by years of war and corruption, struggled to hold the cities and the hearts of the people. In a series of lightning campaigns, Mao's armies swept south, capturing city after city. Nationalist resistance crumbled. Millions of Chinese desperate for stability and change welcomed the Red Army as liberators. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing and proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China. For the first time in a century, China was united under a single government. It was a victory that promised hope, a new era of pride and possibility for a nation that had suffered so much. But beneath the celebrations, new challenges and new dangers were already taking shape. The birth of the People's Republic of China was greeted with euphoria by millions. After a century of humiliation, civil war and foreign domination, hope finally returned to the hearts of ordinary people. Mao and his party promised a new era: land for the peasants, education for the masses, equality for women, and an end to corruption. In the countryside, landlords were stripped of their estates and land was redistributed to poor farmers. Literacy campaigns swept the nation within a generation. Millions could read and write for the first time. New clinics and hospitals sprang up, bringing basic healthcare even to remote villages. For many, life genuinely improved. Women saw sweeping changes. Arranged marriages were banned. For the first time, women could divorce abusive husbands, own property, and seek jobs outside the home. Traditional gender roles began to shift, especially in the cities. But as optimism soared, so did the party's appetite for control. Dissent was not tolerated. Mao's face appeared on posters in newspapers and in classrooms, his words law. A vast network of informants watched for counter-revolutionary behavior. Landlords, capitalists, and suspected enemies were publicly denounced, imprisoned, or executed. Even intellectuals were not safe. The 100 Flowers campaign briefly allowed free criticism, but it was a trap. Those who spoke out were swiftly silenced, sent to labor camps, or worse. A climate of fear grew alongside the new prosperity. The new China was both inspiring and intimidating. Mao had brought progress and hope, but demanded absolute loyalty in return. The seeds of future tragedy were already sown beneath the surface of this newfound unity. By the late 1950s, Mao believed China was ready to leap ahead of the world. He announced an audacious plan, the Great Leap Forward, a campaign to rapidly industrialize the country and transform its agriculture. Communes replaced family farms. Peasants were ordered to work collectively, eat in communal kitchens, and abandon private plots. Across the country, people melted down pots, pans, and even farming tools in backyard furnaces, all in a race to produce steel. At first, the spirit was electric. Propaganda posters declared, "Surpass Britain, catch up with America." Officials exaggerated success. Party leaders feared reporting bad news, but beneath the surface, disaster brewed. The communal farms failed to produce enough food. To meet impossible quotas, fields were left unharvested or crops wasted. The infamous Four Pests campaign, especially the war on sparrows, disrupted the ecosystem and triggered locust swarms that devoured crops. Famine swept the countryside. Villages that once bustled with life fell silent. Families starved. Some parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. There were even reports of cannibalism in the hardest-hit regions. As millions died, Mao's government denied the crisis. Speaking of starvation was forbidden. Local officials covered up the truth, terrified of punishment. Relief only came years later after policies were quietly reversed and private farming allowed again. In just 3 years, between 30 and 50 million people perished, the worst famine in human history. The Great Leap Forward became a monument to the dangers of blind faith, unchecked power, and the terrible cost of denying reality. The aftermath of the Great Leap Forward was devastating, and Mao's grip on power slipped. Moderate leaders stepped in, quietly restoring private farming and trying to rebuild what had been lost. But Mao was not ready to fade into history. In 1966, at 72, he made a dramatic return, taking a swim in the Yangtze River, broadcast nationwide as proof of his vitality. Soon after, he launched one of the most radical and chaotic campaigns in modern history, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Mao called on China's youth to rise up against old ideas and the so-called enemies of the revolution. Millions of students became Red Guards, waving the little red book and marching through the streets. They attacked teachers, intellectuals, and anyone accused of opposing Mao's vision. The chaos was overwhelming. Schools closed. Historic temples, artworks, and cultural treasures were destroyed. Old friends and even family members denounced each other in public struggle sessions. Violence and humiliation became daily life. As factions within the Red Guards turned on each other, anarchy spread. Mao encouraged the turmoil, believing it would renew the revolutionary spirit. But in reality, millions were persecuted, imprisoned, or killed, and a generation grew up traumatized and undereducated. The Cultural Revolution left scars on China that still have not fully healed. By the time Mao died in 1976, the country was exhausted, its society fractured, and its people desperate for stability. Yet Mao's image remained untouchable, immortalized in statues on billboards and in the memories of those who survived his storms. On September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong died at the age of 82. The man who had dominated China for nearly 3 decades was gone, but his shadow remained. The country he left behind was weary, wounded, and uncertain. Tens of millions had suffered under his radical campaigns. The economy was stagnant. Education industry and basic trust in government had all been shaken. But still, Mao's image loomed large. His portrait continued to watch over Tiananmen Square, and his words echoed in textbooks and speeches. Power struggles erupted within the Communist Party. His widow Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four attempted to seize control, but they were arrested within weeks. The tide was turning. Emerging from the chaos was a man Mao had once purged, Deng Xiaoping. Unlike Mao, Deng was a pragmatist. He kept the Communist Party's monopoly on power but rejected the rigid ideology that had caused so much suffering. In the years that followed, Deng led sweeping economic reforms. He opened China's doors to the global market, allowed private business to grow, and encouraged foreign investment. The results were staggering. Between 1978 and 1997, China's GDP soared. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Cities expanded, factories buzzed with activity, and life slowly improved for many. But the scars remained. Censorship continued. The party still controlled speech, memory, and history. And while Deng declared that Mao had been 70% right, 30% wrong, even that cautious criticism would have been unthinkable during Mao's lifetime. The China that emerged after Mao was stronger, richer, and more open to the world. but it would never forget the man who made and nearly broke it. Mao Zedong's story is not simply the story of a man, but of an entire nation's pain, ambition, and transformation. For some, Mao will always be the hero who cast off a century of humiliation, who united a broken country and gave hope to the poor and forgotten. For others, he remains a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, blind ideology, and the willingness to sacrifice millions for the promise of a better future. His face still looks down from Tiananmen Square. His name remains etched in textbooks and in the memories of those who lived through revolution, famine, and war. China's journey from chaos to order, from isolation to global power, cannot be told without Mao, but neither can the terrible price. The legacy of Mao is everywhere, in the factories and schools he built, in the wounds he left behind, and in the debates that still divide his people today. To understand modern China, its pride, its anxieties, and its restless search for meaning, is to grapple with the shadow of Mao. The lessons are clear yet sobering. Progress can come at a terrible cost. Great dreams must be balanced by compassion, truth, and humility, and the fate of millions can rest on the choices of a single flawed human being. As China moves forward, the world watches a nation forever marked by the man who made it and by the millions who paid the ultimate price for its rebirth.